Hello, and thanks for joining today's webinar with Real Story Group. This is an exciting one for us as we're rolling out our newest research area, e-commerce technology. I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Tony Byrne, who's the founder and CEO of Real Story Group, and Apoorv Durga, our lead analyst in this space. They'll be taking us through the heart of today's presentation, but I'm going to kick things off with a couple housekeeping items of note and a little bit of background about Real Story Group. I noticed some familiar names here on the line with us, but for those that are new to RSG, my name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here with Real Story Group. And as part of today's presentation, you will be able to get a copy of the slides after today's session. So keep an eye out from an email from our marketing team over the next couple of days, and then a recording will be made available on our website as well. Also, we will have some time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions or feedback that you want to share, you can just enter those into the questions tab and go to webinar control panel, and we'll get to those at the end of today's session. So a little bit of background about Real Story Group. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, which is something that we're really excited about. And from our inception as an organization, we've always taken the same model, which is we always sit on your side, the buyer side of the table, and never work for or advise the vendors that we cover in any way. For those of you that have read Tony and Apoorv's research in the past, you'll know that we take a pull no punches approach in detailing what the vendors do well, but maybe more importantly, what they don't do so well, where they could fall short for you. So our goal as analysts and advisors to you in this space is to share with you what's going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do. And today we're going to talk about that in the e-commerce space. Here is our subway map, which I'm going to let Tony talk through and kick things over to him. So Tony, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Scott. Many, if not most of you, have seen this map before. It's in its 13th year now. This shows all the different vendors that we evaluate across different marketing, across the marketing technology stack, and where those vendors overlap across different marketplaces. And we always thought that kind of a subway map was one of the best ways to visualize this. Today finds us looking at e-commerce, and e-commerce is really interesting because it's almost kind of cross-cutting. I mean, it really relates at some level to all of these other technologies. You could argue whether it's part of a marketing stack or not. I think the input that we've gotten, certainly from our leadership council and from others, including some of you on this call, is that e-commerce now more than ever after the pandemic and during the pandemic is a key part of your broader kind of omni-channel customer engagement strategy. And for many of you, in fact, it's kind of the central way that you engage. And so is it part of marketing technology or not? We tend not to argue this point. I think the important thing is that the tools you select and what we'll get into today is, in particular, the architectures that you choose are fundamentally important. And so these are areas traditionally where we've taken great interest, and now we've taken our typical kind of critical lens towards the vendors in this space. So I'm really excited about it. I'm going to turn the floor over here to my colleague Apoorv Durga, who has spearheaded this research. And he's going to take you through the key highlights, including the all-important business scenarios, which we use to evaluate vendors. And then I'll wrap up with a few thoughts about how you actually approach this market as a technology customer. So Apoorv, we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Tony. So let's start with some key highlights of our research that we are releasing this week. This will help us contextualize some of the things that we will discuss when we talk about how to select the e-commerce products and vendors. So this e-commerce marketplace is highly competitive marketplace with existing vendors and range of capabilities. But what we have found out is that the older architectures still predominate. Right. So what that means is that a lot of these products have monolithic architectures, single tenant architectures with limited PaaS hosting options and so on. Right. And therefore, there is a substantial technical debt among existing vendors, especially the mega enterprise software vendors that we'll look at in a later slide. But the good news is that new vendors and new categories are continually emerging. So this pandemic has resulted in a big boost to direct to commerce or DTC or D2C, and therefore companies who were happy selling on third-party marketplaces are now building their own e-commerce setups. And as a result, several new e-commerce vendors are likely to emerge. So across multiple categories, and this has led to the rise of what we call e-commerce stacks. E-commerce initiatives differ widely in terms of complexities and capabilities, and there are some core capabilities in across all e-commerce initiatives, but most companies often end up building their own e-commerce stacks. uh, they build those e-commerce stacks by bringing in several types of capabilities from different products and so on, right? And as a result of that, several new ways of architecting and stacks and things like that are emerging, and we'll discuss that also in a bit more detail later. Our research also finds headless commerce to be growing. Now, most e-commerce stacks, like I just mentioned, are composable, right? So what that means is that there is nothing called an end-to-end e-commerce platform. You really have to build them, right? And therefore, a key criteria is that your e-commerce platform should play well with other technology platforms. And headless commerce is a key enabler for this. Uh, what we found here though was that the traditional platforms lag here. They lag in terms of providing headless capabilities. They would claim that they do headless, but what they are doing is essentially providing API wrappers on top of their existing capabilities, and that's not really headless. But there are key trade-offs here, because those incumbent or traditional platforms bring in a lot of rich native capabilities. The final highlight is the scenarios. So we have defined seven scenarios for this marketplace. Some of you might know what a scenario is, but if you don't know, think of a scenario as a business use case, right? In spite of what most vendors claim, the fact remains that not all vendors can do all those scenarios equally well, right? So it is very important to understand where their strengths and weaknesses lie, and these scenarios help us do that really well. So we will talk about these 7 scenarios and how to use those scenarios to be able to select the right platforms for your needs in a bit. Now let's talk a little bit about e-commerce in context of architecture or stack. An e-commerce platform is not really a standalone platform with shopping cart and catalog and all that, right? It often has several other capabilities, or it requires several other capabilities. So for example, it needs to rely on some sort of content management capabilities to be able to create a product information pages or landing pages. It needs to rely on data capabilities for things like managing behavioral data or managing browsing data and taking some actions based on that. It also needs to have some sort of a rules component, right? So the rules that you need to use for personalizing your experience, or the rules that you need for creating product recommendations, A/B tests, experimentation, and all of that. In order to be able to do all that, you need some sort of a planning component. So planning your campaigns, or planning your product releases, planning your go live dates, and so on. And you want to be able to do analytics while doing all of this. So marketing attribution, or LTV, or other KPIs, right? But when you look at a broader architecture or a stack such as the one shown in the next slide, you will see that e-commerce is not the only platform that has all these components. So this slide shows a sample of a stack that's common in organization, right? So you have the channels on top, which are used by your users to interact with you, and then you have some sort of interaction and delivery environment, and finally you have some content and engagement management platforms, right? So a lot of organizations have these kind of stacks. Of course, the exact subset of these applications or platforms will vary, but this gives you a broader idea. Now the big problem here is that since all these boxes, e-commerce, CRM, social engagement, etc., have their own repositories, like I mentioned in previous slide, And what that means is that your data is actually stuck in all of these siloed repositories. So for example, this left box here called e-commerce has its own set of content, data, rules, planning, and analytics. Similarly, CRM has its own set of content, data, rules, planning, and analytics, and so do the other boxes, right? So same goes for all of these boxes. So the result of this is that each of these silos have their own experience, or they present their own experience to the end users. What that means is that if you wanted to do something that is cross application, such as using data in your WCM to personalize your experience on e-commerce, or using rules in your e-commerce to personalize your marketing automation, that kind of a thing would not be trivial to do. It would be very difficult to do anything that is cross application or cross channel, right? And therefore, if you have to mitigate these kind of cross channel or omni channel issues, you need to think differently about your architecture or stack. The next slide shows an example of how this could look like, right? So this is what we call a reference architecture. So this is a reference architecture. Of course, it gets customized based on your needs, but essentially what you will notice here in this reference architecture is that there is a separate section called enterprise foundation services at the bottom, right? We call this enterprise foundation services, and it essentially abstracts all the individual components that we just discussed, right? So for example, all your content management across all those applications is now abstracted into its own layer called omnichannel content platforms. And similarly, your rules across all of these applications are now part of the journey orchestration, which is the blue box that you see, right? And so on, and all your data is part of customer data activation, and so on and so forth, right? So the lower layer essentially works across all those channels or all those platforms and ensures that you have a much better and coherent customer experience. Now, specifically in context of e-commerce, you should consider e-commerce as a part of broader stack such as this one. And so instead of concentrating all those capabilities such as content personalization as part of your e-commerce, you should look at this sort of an abstraction to keep that layer agile. Of course, there will be trade-offs, but that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to overstate that point, Apoorv, that we're arguing here is that in the stack for the 2020s, your e-commerce investments have to fit into your other investments, and you don't want to duplicate and create yet another silo just at a time when we're trying to get out of these other silos. So it's a really important point you're making there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's talk of scenarios now, right? So like I said, think of scenario as a business use case, right? So a lot of vendors will tell you that they can do pretty much everything that you want their tool to do, but the fact is that often these products, when they were initially created, they were created based on a specific use case or a specific customer experience, so specific customer requirement. Of course, over time they broaden their capabilities, but those essential roots are still important for you to find out what their strengths and weaknesses are, right? So we define these 7 scenarios or 7 business use cases, and we'll look at some examples in previous slides, but to quickly summarize the scenarios, there are 2 scenarios based on business model, so B2B and B2C, depending on whether you want to support your B2B initiatives and or B2C initiatives. Not all products have capabilities across B2B and B2C, so that's an important way to differentiate between these products. Then we have 2 scenarios based on distributed commerce. So there is multi-store commerce and multi-channel commerce. So whether you want to support multiple stores or you want to support things like ordering on one channel and picking up from another channel, so that's covered in multi-channel commerce. And then you have special use cases, so capabilities that are required for selling digital goods, for marketplaces, and for selling services. Now, some people would argue that these are just simple cases of B2C, but as we will see, there are often very specific requirements that get added on for marketplace or for digital goods or for selling services, and that makes it an important criteria for differentiating between these platforms. So let's quickly look at some examples. The next slide is an example of B2B scenario. So a B2B scenario often requires you to add on capabilities such as quote management, pricing negotiation, workflows for purchase orders and quotations, which are typically not there in a B2C. So this is a screenshot from Adobe Commerce, and this shows you how they have workflows for managing purchase orders, your quotes, and things like that. There are other capabilities such as defining organization rules, such as your spending limits and so on, right? So those are some other capabilities. The next example is of multi-store commerce scenario. So the idea here is that you want to be able to create different storefronts from the same platform or from the same instance of the platform, right? Of course, you can go to Shopify and create multiple stores, but those are all separate instances, right? So you want to be able to create multiple storefronts from the same instance. And many enterprises need to support those multiple stores. So there could be separate stores, for example, for each brand, a separate store for, let's say, separate geography, or just multiple stores across multiple businesses, but all of them having a common backend. So you can share price lists, you can share product attributes, you can share content across those multiple stores. The third example is of distributed commerce. So this scenario is relevant when you want to support distributed commerce across multiple different channels or different venues. So that includes different physical stores as well. So in addition to the previous scenario, or in addition to the capabilities that we looked at for the previous scenario, this adds several additional capabilities. So for example, things like ordering online but picking up from store, or picking up or ordering online but having a store deliver it to you, right? So those are some of the capabilities that make this particular scenario rather interesting. The next one is if you want to support selling digital goods rather than physical goods. Now, you could argue that a digital good is a simple thing where you don't need to do fulfillment, for example. But on the other hand, there are some additional capabilities required here, such as the capabilities to manage DRM, for example, digital right management, or licensing issues for audio and video, right? So there are several different capabilities required for digital goods, and not a lot of products, to be honest, do this well. For example, Magento here has a product type called downloadable goods, but beyond that, not a lot. Similarly, Shopify has some capabilities there, and there are some plugins that you can use to implement it. But in general, this is a scenario where there is a rather weak support amongst all the vendors. The next scenario is if you want to support multi-vendor marketplaces, right? So think of it as your own Amazon or eBay, right? So where you have multiple sellers and each of them have their own storefronts and so on. So you need capabilities to not just manage individual products, but you have to have capabilities to manage those vendors, their contracts, their pricing, ensuring there is some sort of standardization across multiple vendors, and all of that. Again, this is another scenario where none of these products have great support, but some of them integrate with third-party vendors or third-party plugins to be able to provide these kind of capabilities. The final scenario here that we have here is support for selling services. So think of things like booking a doctor's appointment, or advisory services, or legal consultations, events, home services, booking an appointment for your pet, right? So there are often some challenges, or actually a lot of challenges when you're going to be selling these services. So things like contracts for those services, warranties of those services, and so on, right? So like I said, scenarios are very important way to select these products for your specific needs. In fact, I believe that a scenario based comparison is much more useful than a feature based comparison. So Tony will now cover how exactly you run a selection project using an agile scenario based approach. So over to you, Tony.
Great, thanks, Apoorv. That was a really great tour of a complicated marketplace and really distilling, I think, what are some of the key business objectives that you might have. And of course, it's critical, we'll see in a minute, to prioritize among these. Just want to remind everyone that we welcome your comments, feedback, any anecdotes you want us to share, and certainly any questions that you may have for us. Just use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll definitely have time to cover those. So let's review briefly, let's tie together this whole question of, you're evaluating these because nominally you're looking to select, and it could be that through mergers and acquisitions or other things, maybe you've got 2 or 3 incumbent platforms. We run into that a lot, and so how do you even distinguish between them? So at Real Story Group, after helping companies select tools for nearly 2 decades, we finally encapsulated our methodology into a book a couple years ago, The Right Way to Select Technology. And the real premise here was to apply design thinking to the whole process. So to really make sure that it was business focused, team-based, and above all, empirical and adaptive, which means that it's really reliant on actual user stories that vendors can demo and that you can test in a hands-on way. And so when you apply design thinking, typically there's phases to it. This is really canonical design thinking here: empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping, and testing. And we've converted this into kind of a filtering process where, initially you may look at, in some of the marketplaces we cover, 36 vendors as you create your diverse user stories, which then you convert into business use cases. Those then drive your vendor shortlist. You bring in vendors for proposals and demos, maybe 4 of them. And then key thing there is to have a hands-on bake-off where you do some prototyping and then potentially testing, doing deeper testing on a single finalist. So it's a filtration process where you don't have to get your requirements perfect up front, but you start with user stories, which are, first of all, very real and human-centered, but also very testable in an agile, iterable way. And to that extent, also very correctable, right? So you don't have to get them perfect at first, but you'll improve them from the RFP round to the demo round, and from the demo round to the bake-off round. So how do you get to a short list? Well, Apoorv showed you a little earlier a screenshot from our Real Quadrant decision tool. So Real Quadrant is our answer to static monolithic quadrants. Instead, you feed in what use cases and what strategic attributes are important for you, and it spits out a list of vendors. And so here, if we have use cases here, selling services or digital goods or marketplaces, you can see across 4 vendors, some very different sort of ratings here. As Apoorv mentioned, many vendors suffer when it comes to digital goods, and also marketplaces, you're seeing some weaker scores. But selling services, there's at least a couple of vendors that are plausible here. So we give you head-to-head comparisons of the different vendor tools across these different capabilities, so that you can make some comparisons. And ultimately, as Apoorv mentioned, some trade-offs. So, here's an example from SAP, where we took, some of, again, the digital goods, marketplaces, multi-store commerce. This comes right out of our research, where you can dig down and get a little bit deeper. SAP is also the free sample. If you want to download it from our website, you can get that chapter for free. But the key thing to understand here is that not all e-commerce vendors support all use cases or support them evenly. Hopefully that's obvious. And so the best practice really is to sort of prioritize the business importance, so you can match up against which set of vendors are best for your shortlist. So we never ever tell people to use this kind of approach to actually select a tool, right? To just kind of do it in this abstract, bloodless, non-human sort of way, but to do this to get to the right shortlist. That's what you want to do. And once you have your shortlist, then that's when you pull out your own user stories. You have vendors test them. And when you do that, the one thing I want to take away with here in the short time we have is to make sure that you have a hands-on bake-off. So this is at least a week, I would think, with an e-commerce platform for at least 2 different vendors. And at this point, you've already interacted with the marketplaces, around your original user story, so you've refined them. You actually get hands-on testing, so you might actually build a catalog. You might apply some merchandising rules. You might connect to a dummy instance of your of your customer data store with some dummy data in it. And so you're really seeing how is this going to work with real live humans behind in the control panel, right? It's a little bit like we often find that the traditional approach to selecting enterprise software is like going to a car dealer and watching the dealer drive the vehicle around the parking lot, and they say, "Isn't this wonderful? Do you want to buy it?" No, you need to get behind the wheel. These are complicated machinery. You need to get behind the wheel for at least a week. So many things to say about selecting technology in general, but one thing we've discovered from web content management to customer data platforms and everything in between, the bake-off is really essential, so please do not skip that step. At Real Store Group, we've got different templates for how to do this, and have certainly helped our subscribers sort of navigate this whole filtration process. So you definitely want to do that for commerce as well, because of the sheer complexity that's involved in these platforms. So once again, as we look at the map, which we're in the process of updating with a new color for e-commerce, you also need to fit your e-commerce investments in with your other investments, hopefully that you're working on in your foundational services, which are sometimes referred to as your core, like you would build up through Pilates. You know, you're building a core of content and decisioning and data services. And so as you think about how these pieces fit together, there's three ways that RSG can help you. First is, as you see our real quadrant in the upper left, if you're just selecting one of these technologies and you want access to the inside scoop, and you want access to us, and you want access to our decision tools, you can subscribe to one of these research streams. The second way that larger enterprises engage with us is what we call a full stack subscription, where you get access to all of our research and advice on your enterprise stack. And then a subset of those leaders have joined our MarTech Stack Leadership Council. This is an exclusive council that meets every 2 months to talk about all kinds of issues that are on our minds and share details with each other on all kinds of important topics. So Scott can tell you more about that. Number of good questions coming in. Purv and I will take a look at those. In the meantime, Scott, you want to just talk about next steps?
Absolutely. Thanks to both of you. Certainly appreciate that great content. And as Tony mentioned, happy to engage with you further off this call today in regards to sharing more information about the e-commerce research and all the other research areas that we cover. As Tony mentioned, we do have some decision tools that you can try out, and we're happy to show you what that would look like from a subscriber perspective. So if you ever want to see a behind the scenes tour, just email us at explore@realstorygroup.com. That Stack Leadership Council meets again in September about personalization strategy and technology. So if you'd like more info on that, certainly be happy to share that with you as well. We do have webinars coming up each of the next 2 Wednesdays at the same time. So hope you can join us for those as well. And with that, I'll send it back to you guys for the questions that have come in.
Yeah, a couple have backed up here, and I'll take the first two, and then I'll toss one over to you, Apurv. So Sadiq is asking, can we get access to the recording to this webinar? If you're a Real Story Group subscriber, you will get access to the recordings. Everyone will get access to the deck itself. Asif is asking, how about the strategy to start with one vendor for one use case and learn and keep replacing, integrating for additional scenarios? Well, you know, that's certainly kind of an agile way of doing it, Asif. I think the challenge you're going to run into there is, you know, was that really your flagship scenario? Was that the most important thing? And typically, what we would advise is to understand over the next 3 to 4 years, what are all the key scenarios you're going to need to fulfill, and then kind of prioritize those and make sure that you have a plan around your most important business use cases, that you have a plan for accommodating those. It could be through a plugin, could be through a third-party module, could be through a completely separate capability. We're certainly seeing that around content and decisioning and data, for example. So I would say make sure you've got a long-term growth plan and a long-term architecture, and then fit your commerce in there rather than just kind of build one block at a time, sort of willy-nilly. The next question I'm going to turn over to you, Apurv. It's from Scott, and Scott is asking, is there a way to quantify the value of continuity when weighing the options of sticking with and improving your current system versus a complete systems change? Is there a way to quantify the value of continuity, in other words? sticking with your incumbent environment as opposed to a replacement?
So I think it is tough really to quantify these kind of things, right? But there are certain models such as some of which we also provide, right? The maturity model or the effectiveness models that essentially allow you to look at the impact of technology change or a technology implementation on various aspects of your strategy, right? So you could follow one of those models, an e-commerce maturity model or an e-commerce effectiveness model or something like that, and essentially have multiple dimensions that you want to monitor, and then do a self assessment, let's say every 6 months or once every quarter, and look at the differences that you have made to each of those dimensions based on your technologies, right? So that is one way. I'm sure there are others, but I can think of that as one way right now.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about things being difficult to quantify. The only thing I would add there is, Scott, a lot of times when organizations are looking at the incumbent environment, they look at the deficits or the demerits of that environment, the disadvantages, and often it can be measured in terms of reduced productivity, reduced sales, that sort of thing. What we don't often see, but can be critical, are what are the opportunity costs? In other words, what are you missing out on that you could have in another platform, and really try to quantify that in terms of additional, margin or top line revenue. So it's not just sort of what's wrong with the incumbent environment, but what are the opportunity costs that you're foregoing with your incumbent platform, that you're incurring with your incumbent platform. So one other question, Apoorv, which is, where is Microsoft in all this? We haven't seen Microsoft. I believe they sold off their e-commerce platform. Is that right?
Yeah, they
sold it to Sitecore.
I haven't really seen a lot of new customers asking us for Microsoft e-commerce offerings, and you are right. So not just Microsoft, but same thing with IBM, right? So they also sold off their HCL. So they probably have offerings, but we don't see them a lot these days.
Yeah, and I think it's really just it's indicative of the story that you started out with at the beginning of this webinar about technical debt, is that Microsoft just could not handle the technical debt that had built up in Microsoft Commerce over the year. They sold it off to Sitecore really as a support play, where Sitecore is kind of supporting the customers on the platform. And I think there was a similar situation with IBM Commerce, which was a very wide-ranging platform. They sold it along with a big part of their portfolio to HCL. HCL is making an effort to revive it. We'll be watching that. But I think that it speaks to some generational shifts that have happened in the marketplace and the inability of some of the older players to keep up. So, great. Well, many thanks. Go ahead, of course. Yeah.
There's one more question that I see, Tony. So, and I think you can answer that based on your Drupal experience. Some of these tools rely a lot on plugins. What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, you have to love the plugin architecture because it allows you to have a componentized way of adding extensions. I think the lesson we've learned from Drupal and from Magento and e-commerce space and others is that these plugins bring a lot of robustness potentially, particularly when it comes out of an open source community. The problem comes when it's time to do things like upgrade, or when there's times for major architectural refactoring. I think we've seen in our own research, for example, that one of the reasons that it's difficult to deploy SAP and some others in a headless mode is that not all of the plugin modules support that, right? Like you can have an API to the main platform, but if there's no API access to all the different plugins which come from hither and yon, then that's a problem for you if you built your strategy around plugins. And I think you even had a figure about a typical platform may deploy maybe 24 different plugins. So it's a blessing and a curse for sure. Great. Ilan is just clarifying that Sitecore has recoded in MS Commerce and of course added 451, which is a new acquisition they made for headless commerce, to the commerce stack. So Sitecore is now pretty much in the process of replacing the Microsoft environment as well. Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for sticking around a little bit later. Always a pleasure to engage with you. Special thanks to Apoorv for taking us through some great details here. So on behalf of Scott and Apoorv, wishing you a great rest of your week. Bye now.
Bye. Thanks.